Well, welcome to Julie Dent, who's joining me today to have a conversation about her illustrious career. I've known Julie for many years, and I'm really pleased that she's with us today to enable us to explore some of the hurdles that she's overcome and how she's managed to overcome them in finding her own leader within. Welcome, Julie.
Nice to be here. Nice to see you again.
And you. So perhaps you would tell us a little bit about your career and how you've ended up in the role that you're in at the moment as chairman of CoLab in Exeter and a non-executive on the Parole Board Committee.
Well, my career has been a series of mishaps, really. Started out wanting to be a social worker and discovered very quickly that I wanted to make a bigger difference, and went into the NHS and sort of worked my way through. I don't think I had any great aspiration to be a chief exec or do any of the things that I did. I just wanted to make a difference. And I encountered some amazing people along the way who saw some potential in me and helped me. And I also, really concentrated on delivery. I just wanted to do stuff. So became a chief exec of what was then an FHSA when I was 34. And then the NHS as ever reorganised. And I became a director of what was then a health authority. Then went to the region and then went to Whitehall actually and worked in Whitehall in 97 through the election, which was a fascinating time. Then went back to the region and became Director of Performance Management for London, and then became an SHA Chief Exec and loved that. And then life changed. There was another reorganisation and I decided to leave the NHS, not because I didn't love it anymore, but because I'd sort of done everything in London and I felt I needed a change. So then had a portfolio career and I've been chair of London Probation, chair of various charities, and then ended up living in Devon and became chair of the Mental Health Trust in Devon for 8 years, which I loved every minute of, and worked fantastically well with the chief exec there, Melanie. And then my time came to an end and developed more of a portfolio again. So chair of this little charity in Exeter, which is all about vulnerable people. And I made a commitment to myself that lots of people asked me to do lots of things, but I would only do things for charities or organisations who were working with the most vulnerable, because I felt that I had something to offer and I felt that no one else was. and it's always been my sort of driver, really, the most vulnerable.
It's interesting, isn't it, how those drivers really do lead us in a particular direction that sometimes we haven't even ever thought of.
Yeah.
I was quite curious about the fact that you said several people helped you along the way. I think that's quite a common thread that those people who are in leadership roles are quite keen to talk about. So I wondered if you might explore with us a little bit one or two of those people who helped you and how they inspired you to do what you decided to do.
Well, I think the first one was probably Brian, who was the chief exec of the then FHSA, which I worked in. And Brian just believed in me and he just gave me amazing opportunities. If there was something difficult to do, he sent it my way work-wise. And I learned a great lesson from him, which wouldn't apply now, which is always do your boss's post, because then you could choose what you did and leave them with the bits you didn't want to do. But he was such a steady influence, and he encouraged me. I went off and did a master's. I did lots of training. He sent me to meetings that he probably shouldn't have done, and just gave me my head, really. And if I made mistakes, he talked them through and said, well, what have you learned? And he was, not well known, I don't think, for being a great leader, but he was in his own way. And he also taught me the difference between leadership, management, and administration, and that you had to be good at all of them. You know, it wasn't a question of one or the other. And then I suppose two others come to mind. One was a boss I worked for who taught me more about how not to do things than I ever learned about how to do things. He was a catastrophe in terms of leadership. He was a lovely chap and, you know, great dinner party companion, but he couldn't lead his way out of a paper bag. And, you know, I just learned how to take people with me. When I left that organisation, he gave this wonderful speech and said how marvellous it was that Julie had achieved all these things, and he didn't understand it because there was always laughter coming from my office. But she still got the work done. And even up to the day I left, he just didn't get it. And then I think the person I would name who had the most influence was probably John Bacon. John was someone who was a great leader. He worked with Nigel Crisp, and the two of them were a great partnership. But John had something about him. He was so authentic, and he always got out of the complexity into the simplicity. And you know, he wanted things done, and he communicated in a way that got out of that complexity. He also taught me a very humble lesson. He inherited me from a reorganization, and I had a particular view about him, and he had a particular view about me. And about 6 weeks in, he called me into my office, and I thought, well, he's going to say, go, you know, we don't fit. And he looked at me and he said, I owe you a huge apology. I was wrong. I didn't understand who you were. And actually, you're fantastic. And will you stay and work with me? And that was such a lesson in being humble when you get things wrong, particularly about people. And he again gave me fantastic opportunities. Some of them I'm not sure about. I remember him saying to me one day, there are 3 things that will get me the sack. Broadmoor, London Ambulance Service, and A&E. You've got responsibility for all 3.
Wonderful. But there is something important in that, because it sounds like both Brian and John really believed in you.
Yeah.
And how did that help you create your own belief? Because I work with so many people now who are in primary care specifically, who are having real difficulty in finding ways to believe in themselves.
I think that's, I mean, particularly for women. Imposter syndrome lives in all of us. You know, that bit about, I remember Barbara Stocking, who wouldn't mind me saying this, you know, when she became, a regional director, she was at the loo, and lots of conversations happened in the loo, and she said to me, I just don't understand how I got here. And that imposter syndrome, it lives within all of us, but particularly in women. And I think you do have to have people who verbally say to you, you're doing okay. It doesn't have to be big, magnanimous things. It just has to be that, yeah, you're okay. And if you make a mistake, someone who will absolutely support you. And I tried to do that all of my career. So I remember 2 chief execs when I was in Southwest London. They were in primary care in what was then the PCTs. One of them walked in the door and I said, is everything okay? And she said, it's all fine, absolutely fine. And I looked at her and said, but you've got a huge deficit. And she said, no, it's fine. I can do it. It's fine. And I had a long conversation with her, and what became clear was that she wasn't going to back down. And it also became clear that she couldn't stay because she didn't acknowledge that there was a problem and she didn't ask for help. Whereas another one, Helen Wally, walked in the door and said, I've completely effed up. It's just terrible. You'll need my resignation. I'll have to go. And I said, actually, Helen, you now stay and sort it out. And she always says, with hindsight, that was the moment she became a chief exec, when she realised that she had to do both fair weather and foul weather. And that I would be there to support her. And she turned it round. She really did turn it round in a fantastic way. So you have to support people, and you have to say it's okay.
Yeah, and mistakes are our biggest learning opportunities, aren't they? And it
Absolutely.
sounds like you did that with her very, gave her the opportunity to demonstrate that she really could. But so many people that I speak to are terrified of making mistakes.
Well, it's one of those interesting things. I've done a lot of interviewing for executives and chief execs and non-execs in latter years. And if I'm on a panel, you will not get appointed if you answer this question that I always ask incorrectly. And the question is, tell us about your biggest mistake and what did you learn from it? The number of men of a certain age who say, well, I haven't made any mistakes. And that's finished for me. I can't deal with that. I also ask a supplementary, which is what's been your biggest success and what did you learn from it? Because we learn from both. Yeah. But actually, mistakes are what happens every day. Whether you fail to say hello to the receptionist properly and you think, oh God, that's I need to go back and say, sorry, I was thinking about something else, through to those big mistakes you make in big strategic decisions. They are what makes you a leader. I might have a comment on the current leadership of this country and say the best thing that anyone could do right now is admit they made a mistake.
But isn't that often the hardest thing for many people? But once they do it, they're released somehow, and it enables them to get on and do what needs to be done.
Yeah, it's not cowardly. It's the right thing to do. It makes you brave to say I've made a mistake. And we have to learn that perhaps earlier in a school or at university or in our training, because there's so much anxiety, particularly in clinicians, the fear of being sued or the fear of negligence claims and all those things. Whereas actually with patients, if you say, look, I'm really sorry, we made a terrible mistake. And this is what we've learned from it, and this is what we're going to do differently as a result, then most patients will work with you with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. And I think I'd like to also pick up on the point about being authentic, because that ties in with this about admitting when you're wrong. But many people say to me, so how do I become authentic? And that always makes me smile. So I'd like to understand your take on that.
I think it takes you a long time, actually, to be yourself, and to be yourself in all situations. In my younger days as a younger manager, I wore the bloody uniform. Sorry, I swore. I'd put that navy blue suit on and that blouse and those court shoes, because I put the uniform on and then I could play the role. And it wasn't till years later that I realized I could just wear what I liked, what made me comfortable. And, I still had a work uniform of sorts, but there is something about how your personality comes over in how you are, how you hold yourself. And I think there's also a moment probably in your 40s when you suddenly realize that all that ambition of probably proving something to someone, perhaps your mother, or your partner or whoever, it doesn't matter anymore, because actually the person you have to prove it to is yourself. And once in yourself you realize that you've made it, you are a nurse, you are a doctor, you are a manager, you are there, then you let go a bit perhaps. But I think we all see through people who aren't authentic. I think with the passing of the Queen, one of the things that we have all remembered perhaps when we met her, or if we had the fortune to meet her, was that smile was authentic. It lit up a room. And you can also tell when a smile is forced.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, we talk about this on one of our programs, our Finding the Leader Within program, about how to help people develop their own authenticity. And people seem to think it's this great big thing that you have to work at in a way that you do studying, but actually it's more about an internal working, isn't it? And understanding who you are and what you stand for.
Yeah, and also understanding that you have strengths and weaknesses, and that you surround people who complement you. Some people will have the same strengths, but you need people who support your weaknesses, and that's part of being authentic. Is actually saying, "I'm not very good at this, so I need somebody who is," and having them alongside. But I think it isn't a great. I think it is a moment where you realise that you can be yourself, and it's because you realize you don't have to play at this. It's not about being an actor and putting on that uniform. People want you because you're you.
Absolutely, that is just so powerful. So could we kind of explore some of the maybe the most difficult thing that you did in your career and how you got yourself through it? Because, as you know, lots of people are facing those massive obstacles at the moment in the health system.
I think my most difficult moments, you know, looking back, have been both about small stuff and big stuff. So, you know, everything from, you know, I was doing emergency planning, so I was there for the London bombing and that sort of stuff. But those big decisions you make because you've got the knowledge base and the people around you to do that. And then it always goes down to things like telling someone that they're in the wrong job, you know, and that very personal look you have to give someone in the eye, and then help them move on and do other things. And then in the middle are events which you hold dear. Those are when things did go wrong. So a moment at London probation, I'd been there for 6 weeks. I already knew that there were huge governance issues and I was concerned about the performance of the organisation. And then two young men lost their lives because of a mistake by probation. And that moment of understanding that you now have to change the organisation from the worst possible place is when you have to step up. And I remember going to see the then Secretary of State and saying to him, "You have to tell me now, am I part of the solution or am I the problem? Because you need the person who's going to be part of the solution." And he said, "No, absolutely, I want you to be part of the solution." And then I had the freedom to go on and make some very, very difficult decisions about individuals and the organisation. But eventually we turned it round. I appointed a fantastic chief exec and she and I turned it round. But it was a good 5 years' work to do that from a terrible place.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the fact that you were able together to turn that around speaks volumes, doesn't it? Doesn't it really? And that kind of leads me to the point about people often say to me, how can you be a female leader because most of the leaders are still men? Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I do think there's something about our approach is often different. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that, because there are cultures around the world where, you know, they have been led by women for centuries.
Yeah.
It's our culture.
I think it's really hard. You know, I was very fortunate in my career. I benefited from something called the Year 2000, which was a project funded by the NHS to get women through the glass ceiling by the year 2000. And a number of us went through a very intense programme to get us ready to take on those leadership roles. So I benefited hugely from that. And a lot of those women are still around doing extraordinary things. Carolyn Regan, you know, Chris Outram, you know, we all benefited from it in a huge way. But I think there is still a male-female. I thought that we'd made a lot of progress until I moved to the West Country, where I encountered more misogynism in the first few years here than I've ever encountered in my whole life. And that's because they hadn't had female role models. They have now, and some of that has changed. But I mean, this is a personal story, but it illustrates it well. We were applying for planning permission for our house. And we had to go to a planning meeting in the council. We walked in the door, my husband and I, and it was all male, all over the age of 65, all grey. And there was one woman in the room, and she was taking the notes. And she came up to us and said to my husband, when you present your case, this is where you'll stand. And my husband said, I'm not doing it, my wife is. Well, it went round that council chamber, you know, you could hear it, people elbowing each other. Did you hear, the wife's going to do it? As if I, you know, was doing a striptease or something. It was just extraordinary. So I think it's still real. It's what upsets me most about equality and diversity, which I've you know, championed all my life, is how can we support people from ethnic minorities or disabled if we can't get gender right? Because if we can't get gender right, nothing else works. So I think there is a difference, and I think there are still pockets of male-female models. If you look at the number of chairs in the NHS, unfortunately, it's not equal. The number of non-execs is not equal. I think we've made huge progress on the exec side, but probably not enough. And if you look in nursing, the number of male directors of nursing compared to the number of female and in the workforce, it's still not right.
Yeah, it is quite interesting. That always makes me smile when I look at that. But no, absolutely. And I could carry on talking to you all morning about these things.
But you know, I think you know, but we have to continue to support women, and I don't always believe in quotas, but actually setting ourselves targets which say it will be 50-50. Or even 52-48, because that's actually the population, you know, would be a good starter.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, thank you so much for spending your time with us this morning. I'm sure when people listen to that they'll get some real little gems and some insight. So we really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.